So I will proceed. Of course, we can only guess how much the accused woman telling about such promises believed in their feasibility, but interesting for us here is the motive of such story, an obligation to mention man's promise. Such motive becomes logical in the context of honor. At that time, idea about honor had a very specific meaning. If for women it was primarily associated with virginity, for men and the concept of honor often appealed to his ability to keep promise. Strategy chosen by the accused woman in a court very often had used a discrepancy between man's words and his actions, advantageously presenting this woman as a victim of circumstances, or even more broadly, her situation became an evidence of declining society, a typical trope of moral panics at the turn of the 20th century. According to the Austrian law, a child of the marriage was a child born after 6 months after marriage or 10 months before the divorce, and her father was a man married to a mother at that time. Children born at another time was considered illegitimate. Paragraph 165 of the Austrian Civil Code argued that non-marital children should have a mother's surname and cannot have the same rights with children of the marriage, in particular in the right of their father's family title, his social privileges, and inheritance. Even so, legislators gradually tried to at least minimally ensure the rights of mothers of non-marital children. This in particular as evidenced by the paragraph of the Civil Code which obliged the father to return the mother's expenses for childbirth and expenses for her retention for the first 6 weeks after delivery, and cover expenses for child survival. In practice, this norm rarely worked, as show analyzed cases. In every story with a long-standing relationship between mother and father of a child, women complained about the lack of material assistance on their part from a man and pointed out it as incentive cause to commit a crime. In the testimonies of the defendants, common explanations for non-marital pregnancy also included sexual relationships with employers or their adult sons, or often accompanied it the rape. Double standards, which must have had to be a triviality. An employer imbued with power and money used his position to initiate or force his employee for sexual relationships in the materials of the investigation were not self-evident. Rather opposite, the person who was suspected to benefit the situation had often been a woman. Example of a maid, Freiha Schiffer-Banner, is quite eloquent. Defending her right to compensation as a result of the employer rape resulted in pregnancy, woman received a comment from a doctor who made a medical opinion after the inspection, confirming the coincidence of the period of conception with the dates of the rape. He added to the court that taking into account the age of woman, Freiha was 20-year-old at the time, and the body shape of the plaintiff, quote, she was able to make effective resistance and to defend herself more in case of attack on her virginity by one man without allowing sexual intercourse against her will, end of quote. It appears that the testimonies of maid plaintiffs were double-checked, not only because they were one of the stakeholders, but also because their vision of the situation must have been challenged by default. Widespread ideas about sexual amenability of women from domestic service and vulgarity of their surroundings served as self-evident explanation of their possible cunning plans. The complexity of such explanations also included ideas that man was almost helpless in situation of demonstration women's sexuality. Apparently, fearing misuse of the latter, the advisories books for maids in Polish Poradniki Służby Domowej, which had been actively appearing at that time, were recommending maids, quote, to dress modestly and just in case to close the door in their bathroom with a key. Despite the fact that the stories on sexual relationships between employers and female servants at that time society were not something completely new, in criminal cases, these stories have been reviewed from new perspective. The employer-employees affairs were presented not only through the prism of the crisis of morality, but also as a prime example of social inequality for which this morality had been serving. Among the most common reasons of crimes against children, the accused women listed up lack of funds to survive with a child, connected with this fact, fear for the future, feeling of shame and regret. A direct prerequisite for crimes was the family's refusal to accept a child or inability to pay for this service. According to the testimonies in a court, there was already formed and operating entire female network which provided caregiving service for illegitimate children of urban working women. This way of earning was chosen by a lot of peasant women from nearby villages. The city of Lviv itself was trying to deal with the issue of abandoned children. In early 1890s, a dedicated institution was established, House of a Single Mother, run by Catholic female congregation, Sister of Saint Joseph. A characteristic feature of majority of the accused women testimonies was the emphasis on the fatality of their own fate. The blind determination of the fate, victims of which these women called themselves, had its own logic to the court. The interest in the defendant's family relationships and their origin explained who this person was or could have been. The matrix of the defendants or other documents of the parish government to which they belonged to were frequently added to the criminal cases. According to the court logic, this document had to explain a lot about causes of the crime, lack of proper education, uncertain circumstances of puberty, and bad examples might have been a cause-effect explanations of the crime. Sometimes the convicts had argued their crime by an altruistic purpose, to save a child from the poverty they were in. This argument probably worked, It was important for the court to see something female in the argumentation of the offender's act, to see her maternal instinct struggling with her difficult life. The awareness of the immorality of the crime committed by defendants became a very valid argument in sentencing. It was not just about whether the woman confesses her guilt, but rather how she had been describing her crime. The emotional stinginess of the act she talked about in the eyes of the investigation correlated with the level of her cruelty, and thus it influenced on the punishment she deserved. Poverty was perhaps the most often repeated argument by defendants. Describing their circumstances, these women were emphasizing on the impossibility to work with a child, risk of finding themselves of being homeless and without any means of subsistence. I have done this terrible thing because of despair, describing her crime, one of the accused women. I knew that I would not have been the possibility to keep this child and would not find a job with her. I did not see any other solutions except one, to get rid of the child. When these thoughts had crossed my mind, I did it immediately, wanting to rescue my life at least. Noticeable that those women were articulated not only on their economic situation, but also on the social and gender inequalities they had experienced in various ways. In the format of stereotypes regarding their low moral standards, the risk of being used because of such prejudice, the lack of efficient regulation on factual man responsibility for the illegitimate child. The argumentation of women's guilt of the crime against her child, as well as the understanding of her situation, were constructed through the same flow, morality. Paradoxically, women often won their cases or reduce the severity of sentences using the argument of moral attitude as the same line of defense that the prosecution used against them. To allegations of lack of compassion and empathy toward a child, defendants have been responding with the mirror lack of compassion and empathy toward them from their surroundings, or its double moral standards. Mentioning here, for example, a man and his refusal to help support a child, relatives who drove her out with a baby, or the lack of options for a single woman to make money being a mother. Officially, the punishment for infanticide could have been a sentence of 10 to 20 years of imprisonment, for child abandonment and abortion from 1 to 5 years. The execution could have been adjudicated, but usually was replaced by a sentence with a long-term imprisonment soon after. As analyzed cases show, imposed verdicts in practice were far less severe. It is noteworthy that during 1865-1905, period of imprisonment tended to decrease, while the frequency of cases increased. Thus, if in the 1870s it was possible to come across cases with 10 years of imprisonment closer to the beginning of 20th century, I did not find any. Most often accused women received sentences with several years or months of imprisonment in case of infanticide and several months or weeks in case of child abandonment and abortions. One of the reasons for this difference in sentencing, apart from the specificity of each particular case, could be the jury court, involvement of which became significantly expanded with the wording of the Austrian Criminal Code in 1873. Conceiving as an indispensable factor in the humanization of the law as a result of the spring of the nations, the jury court was increasingly criticized closely to the beginning of the 20th century. The main accusations were the unpreparedness of jury members for their assigned roles, the ignorance of the very basic of law, and over-emotionality in decision-making process. In the infanticide cases, this emotionality played one of the most decisive roles. Lawyer Petros Tebelsky, in his report delivered at the Second Congress of Lawyers and Economists at 1889 in Lviv, providing the analysis of the verdicts handed down by a jury court, argued that in cases against women who killed their babies, quote, the jury regretted the fate of unhappy mothers who were forced to commit a crime and did not take into account the constituency acts at all. The emphasis on the jury sentiment seems to have been advantageously used by the defendants, serving as possibility to negotiate the verdicts. Some of the accused women used this chance, navigating not only the story of crime, but the process of criminal proceeding itself. Accused of infanticide, Maria Petrushin insisted on being judged by the jury court in Lviv instead of Rava-Ruska local court, where she was detained, claiming that otherwise she would commit suicide. Her case can be a good illustration of the women's agency, despite of her 11 previous convictions for different minor offenses. Maria was able to convince the jury court to release her. Being pregnant with employer child, Maria was fired and found herself in a street. Admitting her guilt against newborn child, the core of her argumentation was centered around the circumstances of her single motherhood and disadvantages of being poor woman, and that in this particular case was used by her employer in whose house she worked. A significant reason for sometimes striking differences in the severity of the sentence was the same crime was the language of acknowledging of own guilt. This language was not the same as self-justification, but rather the contrary. It was important not to overdo with the numbers of indirect guilty involved in the cause. In this language, the shame and fear were also important. By giving testimonies, accused women were predicting their life with the shame, emphasizing poverty and loneliness first and foremost. Fatality used by them for describing their destiny served as essentials of their victim's position. Such perceptions revealed main gender pact of late 19th century justice system. Even in crime, women had to be victims. Moreover, they had to want to be them. Their crimes from this standpoint were viewed as social wounds caused by moral disorder of modern society, which force women to face with the challenges of competitive job market, and employment. Prevailing economic argumentation of their crimes, on the one hand, undermined the concept of moral purity, which was much more strictly required from women than from men, and on the other hand, highlighted gender inequality, and in this regard allowed the convicts to find their ways to court understanding. Crime story of Maria Szutek, with whose I have started this presentation, ended up for her with 4 years of imprisonment and with 1 fasting day per week. That was quite common extra punishment for women prisoners at that time. In comparison with similar cases, her sentence happened to be quite severe. Her attempt to argument child death as natural, which was put into the main line of defense, did not work. Even despite the fact that such possibility existed due to baby congenital pulmonary insufficiency confirmed by doctor. Nevertheless, multiple confessions of thoughts to get rid of child told by Maria during the investigation reduced sufficiently her chances to be defensed in this way. Her language of acknowledging of own guilt was complicated. Firstly, by the fact of 2 children born out of the wedlock, and secondly, by the theft she made on the eve. Explaining that it was caused by necessity of child supply, fact of the theft in the eyes of jury court was perceived more as evidence of sustainable moral decline than one-time life mistake. Her victim image was harmed by her active position. It is important to highlight here that the goods Maria had stolen, show and dress, belonged to the family of her child father, and she motivated this act by the need of their child. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivanna. That was a wonderful talk. And I think the answer to your question, can the subaltern speak, is definitely yes. You've created, I think, through these women's testimony, a very large picture, in fact, rather than a small picture. So we get a great sense of society, culture, and the place of women. I very much appreciate how you have used gender and also emotions as tools of analysis. And I think in terms particularly of emotion, this is pioneering in this area. I would like to ask you a couple of questions before we open up the discussion, which I believe we can do through the chat mechanism. And I'll hear whether we can or not through the chat mechanism as well. If you can say a bit more about how you use emotion as a tool, history of emotions, and also where does this paper fit within the larger context of your current project?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question and for the comment. About emotions as a tool. I was struggling working with these documents because the stories they reveal are very damaging. As a to read it, it's very hard. And I was starting to think how my own emotions influence my conclusions or my research and interpretations of what I was reading. So from this standpoint, I was interested to try to look at emotions that the defendants use or have had during the investigation, and how I can use them as a tool to present their way to agency, their way to take action, even having very limited opportunities, possibilities to do it. They were able to do it. Sometimes emotions like strong emotions of guilt was very, well, maybe it sounds bizarre, but they were very rewarding for those women. And I try to emphasize this strategy to use their emotionality as something that was always assigned specifically for women publicly, how they were able to use these tools about emotions, about women emotions in a courtroom and take actions in a way they consciously or unconsciously, but in a way that it helped them or not. So yeah, but I am still in the process of looking for the best methodology to work with emotions and explaining these emotions, because obviously we are talking about people who lived in a different time with different highlights, with different social strata, classification, and they were navigating their life in using different levels of our possible understanding from the standpoint of 21st century person. Yeah.
I have been informed by Dr. Kasarchuk that people should use the Q&A if they have questions or comment rather than chat. But let me just continue. I wanted to ask you if you could also tell me something about the larger context of this project. Are you heading towards a book, for example?
So this project was started for me in my try to find the voices of women from lower classes. I was reading a lot about them from private correspondency of upper class women at that time, Galicia, who were the main focus of my PhD thesis. And I was reading constantly about thefts, about minor offenses they were accused of by their employers. And I was interested to hear their voices by their own, telling on their own. And it was it was a challenge, because obviously the majority of them were illiterate. They had very limited space for living history. There are some sources about their lives. So that's why I ended up with criminal records, because the majority of accused, it happened to be, were actually maids or women who declared hiring service as a way of earning money. So this was the beginning of my my way to women's criminality. And when I started to analyze these cases, I understood that some major conclusions could be made, and one of this, one of the way to make this criminal records one of the source about past of women from lower classes, which usually are very usually had a lot of blind spots, actually can be used. I understand that like mirroring all these criminal records and this criminal autobiographies to all people from lower classes, to majority of people, of women from lower classes, is not probably the best idea. But my point here is that even that these women who were accused of these female crimes, they were often not professional criminals at all. They had zero criminal experience before. So their crimes were not only stories of crime, stories of criminality, but actually their stories were stories that could possibly happen with poor women in a very bad situations. So they were in a way stories from ordinary people. So that's my way of trying to use criminal record as one of the source in its investigation women from lower classes at that time society.
Yet it's much more than a study of women. I mean, what we also see here, and this is why I very much appreciate how you use gender. Unlike my students who think gender only means women, you know how to use this as a real tool of analysis. So what we see here is not only women, but men as well. So both genders, I think, are present, but we also see the state and what the state is prescribing for women's roles, for men's roles. So I see that as a kind of very interesting triangular presentation that feeds into broader cultural history, social history. We have a question from Victor Palis, and he said, how would similar cases be handled in contemporary courts? Difficult question.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I actually haven't thought about this so far. Let's think together. I would say that probably in contemporary court, the position of father of child would be more visible than it was at the turn of 20th century. As I mentioned, father was very like abstract I don't know, person, and the interest of jury court to his position and his guilt or his way of responsibility toward what happened was very limited, or it didn't exist at all. I guess that in today's cases, similar cases, questions toward man's position would be more visible and would be more loud, at least. Well, I'm not sure how it will end and how it influences their sentence for accused women. But I guess in a way it may influence a lot. Regarding abortions as an accusation, so it depends on state, and this triangle, man, women, state, is very visible here. It depends from state to state what abortion policy the state has. But obviously, in states where abortion is not an option, probably sentence for women would be had a place. But in when state policy allows women to have rights on their own body, probably abortion wouldn't be a case. So it depends from, I would say, from this state position a lot toward responding to crimes, female crimes, so-called female crimes, because they all very they all strongly related with women's physiology and hair body, which today's world claims in many states as women's choice to do with her body.
Yes. So, it really struck a chord when you were talking about how women's emotion or non-emotion was judged. That you still see this, at least in North American courts. Women had no affect, and so that automatically puts a kind of black mark on her. We have another question, Ivanna, and this is from our wonderful Slavic bibliographer and the co-chair of the Jacyk Center. And Ksenia Kibizinski asks, have you looked at how the contemporary press of that time covered these crimes or offenses? And how might suicide attempts by women have been treated as crimes? So 2 questions, really.
About contemporary press, I looked and the main line of the press response to women's crime against children was actually very negative one. Like, it was always stories about not women, but somehow evil creatures who did what they did without any empathy, compassion towards toward their children, toward humanity, toward society. So it was narration about fallen women, completely fallen women who did not have any right to be justified. In most cases, at least when we are talking about press of the at the late 19th century. Regarding suicide, actually, I am not able to answer this question. I've never came across with cases about suicide which ended up in a courtroom, unfortunately. So I'm not. I don't really know. Yeah.
Thank you, Ivanna. We have another question from Professor Taras Kaznarski. And it's a long question, but I understand why. So he says, I know you connect your archival research with studies of literary trends of the time. The themes of gender, women emancipation certainly appear strongly in Galician literature at the turn of the 20th century, in part thanks to women writers at the time. Thanks to this, issues of marriage inequality, violence, illicit relationships, etc., became a significant part of the public discourse. So here's the question. To what degree does the topic of female infanticide remain a literary taboo at that time? Of course, there's a classic sensational novel by Stefanik Novina, The News, featuring a peasant widower drowning his small child as an act of desperation and even mercy. But the protagonist is a man. Here's the question. Have you encountered instances of cases when female infanticide or even broader female criminality in literary works appear? If so, how are these narratives and characters framed in terms of pathology, social rebellion, moral critique of society, etc.? I hope you got all that. It's a wonderful question, but it is complicated. Thank you, Taras.
Thank you very much for the question. It's really a very nice question, which can be probably another research. Actually, I would be happy to answer on this question, but unfortunately, I didn't look at this infanticide motifs, narratives within the literature at that time. I tried to do it on the example of some novels which, for example, now it comes to my mind that some novels of Konstantina Malicka were about mother who betrayed, but actually mother who killed. I am not sure that I came across of this novel. So thank you very much for this wonderful question, and I should definitely take a closer look of the infanticide as a topic of literacy at that time. But unfortunately, so far, I'm not able to answer.
As long as you are a researcher now affiliated with our center, I encourage you to contact Professor Kaznarski because I think he knows something about this question. and might provide you some interesting sources. Are there any other questions? Well, Ivanna, this has been a very interesting session. I really like your research. I think I like anything about the subaltern, but particularly when somebody finds out how to get to them. I appreciate this very much, and I look forward to seeing more of your work. I want to thank you, as well as our questioners and the participants. And normally at this time, we would applaud you, and I'm sorry we can't because we're on Zoom. But thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Viola, and thank you very much for the organizers for organization.
Thank you.